record all of this. Anyway, so it's my greatest pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. Samantha Hill. Dr. Samantha Hill is the colleague of Professor Roger Berkovich, who you met on Monday, and who told you about Hannah Arendt on revolution and her thought process on revolution. But Dr. Samantha Hill is something else. Let me tell you this. Are you here, Sammy, while I'm reading this? You might just go crazy at me. But
I'm here.
Dr. Samantha Hill is probably one of my ultimate favorite lecturer. I always find a lecture absolutely fascinating, extremely energetic, and I'm sure you will share this passion of Hannah Arendt with her after you've listened to her for the next hour. Let me introduce you a bit to her. She's the assistant director of the Hannah Arendt Center. She's also visiting assistant professor of politics at Bard College, and she's also associate faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. If you're based in New York, the Brooklyn Institute is based there, and it's an amazing place to get classes and to meet with brilliant philosopher and thinker, just like Samantha. Samantha has been writing a few books, a few recollection of the poetry of Hannah Arendt, and I don't know, is it published now, that book?
No, it's coming. We have a publisher, so it's coming.
So that's it.
Next December 21.
And you trained initially in Germany, so you're also completely bilingual, am I correct? So you can read Hannah Arendt in Germany. I mean, not that she wrote in German, but she did write her poetry.
She wrote some things in German. All 74 of her poems were written in German. She translated some of her work from English into German. Yeah, she wrote in many languages.
Well, so the good news for you is you have a very international cohort. Yeah, they come from pretty much all over the world. So I'm going to, and they will keep on arriving, because there is a tendency that they all arrive a bit late, because because of me, in fact, because I've had some technical issue today. So this is all my fault. But hopefully, hand over to you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for making the time and making this happen. And you're going to share with us some insight on the prologue and the chapter 1 of The Human Condition. Everybody, I'm going to also put it again into the chat bot here, just to make sure that you can follow. If you were to do some reading, they can follow on that. And you will tell them a bit about movement and appearance, according to Hannah Arendt. So
yes.
You go.
So movement and appearance. So I'm going to talk about the preface and the first chapter of The Human Condition, but what I thought would be helpful to do, since I don't know any of you, unfortunately, and we're not meeting in a physical space, would be to kind of give you an overview of these chapters and the way that they connect to her work in On Revolution, and the way that she comes to talk about poetry and appearance at the end of On Revolution. But to spend some time just kind of giving you an outline of what she's doing in the prologue in the first chapter, and setting up The Human Condition, which was her second major work that she published in 1958. So when I often give introductory lectures on Hannah Arendt, I begin by saying that most of her work, in one way or another, is about two things. It's about protecting spaces of freedom and movement, and it is about a question that she writes in one of her thinking journals, one of her Denktagebuche. Gibt es ein Denken, das nicht tyrannisch ist? Is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? And so I'm going to talk about both of these things today in the way that they relate to Arendt's conception of movement and appearance, and why movement is so important for her. So just to give you a bit of background before we jump into the first part of The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt's first major work was The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was published in 1951, the same year she received American citizenship. And it's a nearly 600-page book which draws together various elements of totalitarianism that crystallized in the middle of the 20th century. So she talks about the collapse of the nation state. She talks about our inability to discern fact from fiction as it relates to political propaganda And she talks about the privatization of public political institutions during the age of imperialism and colonialism. And then she ends the book by talking about loneliness and the advent of mass loneliness. And she says that totalitarianism is characterized by what she calls the iron band of totalitarianism, a kind of amassing and atomization of individuals, right? So, which is characterized by a loss of movement. So then she writes The Human Condition, and she writes the prologue and the preface setting it up to talk about the different realms of life and the activities that correspond to those realms in order to think about how we act in the world, how we move in the world. If totalitarianism is the absence of movement, then freedom is characterized by our ability to move. And so when we see the distinctions between the different realms of life collapsing in upon one another, between private, social, public, that's a kind of red flag that totalitarianism is encroaching in our lives. So for example, she talks about in her essay, We Refugees, how going to buy an act of bread becomes a political act, right? It's no longer just something that you can do without having to think about it. And this is a loss of freedom. So let me walk you through some of those distinctions and in The Human Condition and talk a little bit about what she's doing there. So men and not man live on the earth and make the world uncommon for Arendt. The fundamental condition of the world, and she's drawing this in part from Aristotle, is reality, right? The earth make the world together in common. And the human condition deals with the different activities of life, the different activities that we engage in, and the realms in which those activities occur. So we appear on the earth, we appear in the world as distinct individuals who are capable of making new beginnings. And it's our distinctness as individuals which makes us capable of making new beginnings. And this life, the life that you and I have, is a life structured by time, right? So we are born into the world, we appear, and will disappear, right? And this is structured by what Arendt calls a kind of biohistorical time, the past, the present, and the future. It's a kind of calendar time that will continue after we disappear from the world. And this is going to circle back to relate to her conception of revolution, because a revolution is a turning around, right? And so we make things in the world with our hands, right? The poiesis, we make things, and they are more durable than we are, right? So things can outlive us. And we live in a world of things that have been made by people. And these objects are incredibly important because these objects which were made condition our existence. They mediate our experiences. So whatever kind of action that we engage in, whatever it is that we make, it's always going to be of this world. Arendt is always firmly rooting our feet in the realm of worldly affairs. There is no other world that we make that exists beyond the present, that exists beyond the ways in which our thinking moves from our experiences of acting in the world. So all of our activities then are conditioned by this fundamental fact of our human existence. And for Arendt, the kind of underlying fundamental fact of human existence is plurality. It's our togetherness. And while this is true for all activities, it has a particularly special relevance for Arendt's conception of action. She says that we cannot even begin to imagine action outside of the society, something that in concert with others in a public sphere. And in this sense, Arendt's conception of action and the public sphere is incredibly physical. It requires physically appearing before one another. So Arendt wants to claim a space for politics in the public realm, apart from other areas of life. And politics is, for Arendt, the political organization of life, which stands in sharp contradistinction to the private sphere, which is where we maintain life, right? And so the question of politics for Arendt is a question about how we form political communities with one another, and how those political communities rise out of the realm of human affairs. Everything that's merely necessary or useful is excluded from the public or political realm. And so the public realm is where we come together. It's the physical space where we appear before one another, where we come together in speech and action. And we disclose who we are as distinct individuals capable of making new beginnings through our speech and through our actions. And we use these capacities, these human capacities, for speaking and acting together with one another. We appear before one another. And language is incredibly important for Arendt here, right? And she's very much drawing from Aristotle and Logos, right? We reveal who we are through our speech. Speaking for Arendt is a political action, right? And it's that we speak, right, through this act of speaking, that we can engage in political action, but that we can also change the way that we think about the world, right? So when we appear before one another and when we engage in political conversation, we make arguments, right? We make arguments and we put ourselves as individuals who are revealing ourselves on the line. The politics is the political line, right? We risk being told that we're wrong, that we're racist, that we're sexist, that we're an idiot, right? We risk violence of to our bodies, or we could convince the other person of our argument, right? We could be praised, right? We could engage in a kind of great speech act. So the private realm, in contradistinction to this public political realm for Arendt, is the realm of the home, the place where most of us are now confined, this new amorphous space which has become our social, political, and private. Nellie, are you showing me something?
Yeah, I got into some kind of experimentation with my sister a while before, but nothing very interesting, please.
Okay. I see the gesturing.
Not
So
Hannah Arendt, if this is what you're asking about. No.
So the oikos, the oikia in Greek, right? The home, the realm of the private, is where we retreat. It's where we retreat from the public realm. It's where we escape the light of public life. We get to go inside and nourish ourselves in thinking, in solitude, with family, with friends. And for Arendt, the home is fundamentally a sphere of inequality, right? It's a private space cordoned off from the public, where your speech and actions do not appear before the other to be judged, right? And we all have this sense of going home at the end of a day or escaping. You know, I think my mom used to say, wait to say something until we're in the car and the door is closed, right? You know, or when you get to relax and just be yourself. And this is a different kind of space from the public space, where we are aware of the presence of the other and how their perception of us is impacting and informing the way that we speak and act. And so the realm of the polis for Arendt is the realm of freedom, right? The public realm is the realm of freedom, not the realm of the private. And we appear before one another inner distinction through these words and deeds. So let me just give you a brief passage. I'm not going to give you a lot of passages since you have the text, but on page 36, she says, whoever entered the political realm had first to be ready to risk his life, and too great a love for life obstructed freedom, was a sure sign of slavishness. Courage, therefore, became the political virtue par excellence, and only those men who possessed it could be admitted to a fellowship that was political in content and purpose, and thereby transcended the mere togetherness imposed on all. Okay, so one cannot love life too much, lest one be afraid to act freely, to risk oneself, to risk one's life, right? So we have the private, we have the public, and very important for Arendt, we have the rise of the social. We have the emergence of mass man. So Arendt discusses the emergence of mass man, the emergence of modern individualism, which she connects to a kind of inward destructiveness, right? And for her, this is exemplified in figures like Rahel Varnhagen. She wrote what was to be her Habilitation book about, which was a critique of German Romanticism, the tradition of German Romanticism, figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of others, the Enlightenment. And she is thinking about the way in which this modern phenomenon of mass man, enabled by the emergence of industrial society, marks the erasure of the individual, which stands in contrast to the modern individualism, which for her is defined by social characteristics. So modern privacy is related to her conception of modern individualism and the need to protect the sphere of intimacy. But modern privacy is the opposite of the social. So for Arendt, it's not just the privatization of the public sphere. It's the socialization of the private and public realms, which collapses them in upon one another. So if I had a chalkboard, I would draw you private, social, and public. And what she's describing is the way in which the social sphere rises over and collapses the distinction between private and public, so that there's no meaningful distinction left between private life and public life. Everything becomes subject to the social. And the socialization of life infringes upon our ability to speak and act in the public realm. It infringes upon our ability to distinguish ourselves as individuals meaningfully through word and deed. And so for Arendt, the rise of the social creates a kind of worldlessness, right? So if we act in public, if we engage in action, if we engage in poiesis to make the world in common, to create a condition of worldliness that gives us a sense of durability and meaning, then the rise of the social and the emergence of mass man, which infringes upon our ability to act and to speak and make as individuals, creates a kind of worldlessness. And this worldlessness comes to condition our existence in the public realm. So it's the possibility of worldlessness for Arendt, and this is a little bit further than the section I gave you. It's the possibility of our disappearance as well from the world that conditions the political alongside the possibility that we can make the beginnings, right? And she says, without the possibility of no politics, no public realm is possible. So I want to just kind of transition thinking about the space of appearance and what it means to act politically, what it means to engage in this kind of political action in relationship to the way that she thinks about what she calls the lost treasure of revolution, revolution in her book On Revolution, just to tie it in for you. So at the end of On Revolution, Arendt turns to the French poet and resistance fighter René Char to describe what she calls the lost treasure of revolution. And the treasure, she says, is that he thought he had found himself, that he no longer suspected himself of insincerity, that he needed no mask and no make-believe to appear. Mask has new meaning now. I can't not trip on that word, right? That wherever he went, he appeared as he was to others, to himself, that he could afford to go naked. And so in order to capture this lost spirit of revolution, Arendt is taking Char's poetic aphorism here, and she's giving us a metaphor for authentic appearance and action in the public realm. So Char's revelation that he had found himself, that he could appear without a mask before others, that he no longer had to be insincere, is a kind of authentic experience that's not otherworldly, right? It's an experience that he had in the midst of fighting for the resistance. And it was in action that he was able to take off his mask of appearance and appear to himself and others as he was. So the experience of public freedom that Arendt's describing here in Char, through Char's language, depicts a way of being in the world that is, in a certain sense, more authentic and more sincere. And she's thinking about the men of the American Revolution and the men of the resistance in France, and how they came together in action in a public space in order to begin something new through their actions, where they were released from the demands of everyday life. And because they were released from the demands of everyday life and thrown into the state of political immediacy where they had to act, it was possible to live a fuller and, in a sense, a more authentic life. So I don't want to read you I'll just read you a couple of sentences. I'll just read you two. Char talks about a quote from Char: "At every meal we eat together, freedom is invited to sit down. The chair remains vacant, but the place is set." Okay. And so these men of the resistance that Arendt's talking about, who are engaging in political action, found themselves and peeled back the mask society had imposed on them and that they had created for themselves because they were fighting against tyranny. Not because they were fighting against tyranny, but because they had something to challenge. They became challengers. They had a fight to win. They could no longer exist passively in the world. They had to act, and in acting, they created a public space where freedom could appear. And here Arendt is talking about the world of public appearances, and she appeals in a part to a kind of language of thinking about the table that's set, that somebody could walk through the door at any moment and sit down. There's always the possibility that somebody new will appear, right? That the new beginning is possible. And for Arendt, the experience of freedom is described as a kind of visitation, right? As this kind of real, genuine experience in the space that we create and open up where freedom might emerge, right? But it's not something that exists extant or becomes crystallized. It's something that's always coming into being and requires human engagement and action. So in order to kind of tease this out, Arendt ties René Char's poetry to a parable from Franz Kafka about he, in order to think about this question of thinking. We've been talking about the space of freedom and the public political realm, and I just want to tie it to this conception of what does it mean to think in a way that's not tyrannical, to the other question in Arendt's work. So in Between Past and Future, Arendt gives us this, and in her work on thinking, she gives us this parable from Kafka. And she talks about where are we when we act? where are we when we think? What is the space of action? What is the space of freedom? And she finds a parable for this space in Kafka. And it's an in-between space. And it's the kind of in-between space that the poet Shar himself was occupying at the end of the resistance, with liberation on the horizon. Where are we in the world of appearances? So Kafka describes it as the past pressing us forward and the future pressing us back. And the war between these two temporal forces causes man, he, to rise above the flow of linear time and to be able to look down upon the field of action like an umpire. And Arendt says it's only because man is inserted into time, appears, that he's able, only to the extent that he stands his ground, does the flow of indifferent time break up into tenses. She says it's the insertion, the beginning of a beginning, which is an Augustinian term, which splits up the time continuum into forces which then, because they are focused on the particle or body that gives them the direction, begin fighting with each other and acting upon man. So it's the insertion of man, right? And you can think of this as man's appearance in the world, of our appearance in the public sphere, of our engaging in action, that breaks up the endless and indifferent flow of ordinary time, right? And it's this appearance in the world of things, which existed before and which will remain after, that contains the possibility of the new for Arendt. So the appearance, the presence, right, in the world fights time simply by being, right? It's this possibility that exists, which allows for revolution, which allows for the creation of something new, a turning back around. So let me just add a couple more things and then I will pause for questions. So Arendt, the point, when Arendt turns to Shar and Kafka in order to think about thinking, right? She's trying to address a metaphysical question. She's trying to address a metaphysical question about the nature of being, right? And the meaning of being, right? So the battleground, Earth, right? In Arendt's reading, gives way to a kind of battleground for being itself. So when we appear in public, when we engage in action, we're not just engaging in action in order to make, we're deciding the terms of the meaning of being, right? Through that act of appearing, of being courageous, of making ourselves vulnerable, of making new things, we're also engaging in the creation of meaning and what it means to be a human being. Okay? So right, a being, right? This being, who is it that acts? Who engages in action, right? Who is this person that's conditioned by plurality? Arendt talks about the ego, the thinking ego, the I that acts, right? The time construct of the thinking ego that conditions our sense of self is different from the time sequence of ordinary life, right? Is different from everyday life, which is structured by this linear temporality of past, present, and future, which is affixed by calendar time and recurs endlessly. And for Arendt, this recurrent time, which she calls historical time, structures everyday life, and we need it. It gives us a sense of stability and durability in the world. And she says that we can shape the everlasting stream of sheer change into a time continuum we owe not to time itself, but to the continuity of our business and other activities in the world. So that question, how do we think in a way that's not tyrannical, a few lines later, part of the answer to that question that she gives us is that we cannot get submerged in the stream. We can't get submerged in the stream of time, right? That we have to stand out, to exist, literally means to stand out in the world, to appear. And each individual person has this power, this ability to appear and to act in the world. And it's by virtue of their uniqueness, your distinctness, that you can create something new and meaningful through action. So I'm going to stop there because I think I was talking quickly and I threw a lot at you. So I would love to have your questions, and Nelly can.
Okay, everyone, you know the deal. You ask your question into the little chat section, and then you get your chance to light up onto all of our screen by just asking it directly, or you can just go ahead and it will appear. Don't be shy. Well, we have a question from Zach. Zach, are you there? Our friend Zach.
I'm here.
Yes, Zach, you had a question about Judaism.
Yes, you mentioned that that there was a mysticism in there that Arendt used, and a possibility of somebody new joining in a situation, and that reminded me of some things in Jewish mysticism, particularly in Eliyahu, the prophet who would bring the Messiah.
Yes.
Do you know if her idea of that was derived from Judaism?
So this is in part my reading of Arendt. She's appealing to a kind of language of mysticism when she's talking about the possibility of somebody appearing in the world. I think the primary influence for that doesn't come from the Jewish tradition. It comes from Augustine, which is who she wrote, the church bishop, who she wrote her dissertation on at the University of Heidelberg on love and St. Augustine. And at the time when she was studying Augustine, he was a primary figure of thought for many leading philosophers of the day, Jewish or otherwise, and important to the tradition of existentialist thinking, specifically for Karl Jaspers, who was her doctor father, who was her dissertation advisor. And Augustine talks about the possibility of new beginnings. Now, when Arendt's in exile in Paris in the 1930s, she's also reading Gershom Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, and she had a friendship with him and a lengthy correspondence. So she wasn't, I don't think, intentionally deriving from that tradition of Jewish mysticism or the story of Elijah, though, although the language is certainly evocative of it, I think. Part of that point is that even though Arendt appeals to this language of mysticism or transcendence, she's actually stripping out any kind of transcendental philosophical gesture from her understanding of what it means to act and the conception of being and the meaning of being in the world. Arendt is always firmly planting our feet on the terrain of earthly affairs.
Any more questions? Don't be shy. I know you're not political theorist experts, but I'm sure you have some questions for Samantha. We've got one from Jan.
Okay.
Jan, where are you, my dear? Show yourself on our screens. Appear. Jan?
You're muted, Jan.
Hello, I just to know something more about the speak as the political as the political action, as you talked before?
Yes. So speech for Arendt is a form of action. And she says in let me see if I can pull up a quote for you from the first chapter, when she's talking about plurality in speech, so here at it's on page 4, and it's the last sentence of that paragraph. She says, men in the plural, that is, men insofar as they live and move and act in this world, can experience meaningfulness only because they can talk with and make sense to each other and to themselves. And so she's thinking about the importance of speech, and she's thinking about how speech is losing power. That's part of her political concern here. So she's thinking about the rise of quantitative methodology. She's thinking about the rise of automation. She's thinking about the outsourcing of thinking to different forms of mathematical computation, and the reduction of language to signs and symbols that will have a kind of crystallized, fixed meaning that won't be open to interpretation, that will allow for a kind of mathematical, more universalized speak. But for Arendt, she's holding up the importance of language. Arendt I've had several people who knew her tell me that Arendt used to say that you could tell how smart a person was by the language they chose to use, right? The language that we speak with reveals our thinking, right? So thinking occurs in this kind of invisible realm, but through speech, we make thought visible, or through making, we make thought appear. So in the human conditions, she says that poetry is the form closest to the process of thinking itself. It appears in a condensed form, dict for dict, das Gedicht, right? It's the density, the condensation, the thickness of poetry that makes it durable, in part because it's closest to the process of thinking. Thinking moves from experience, right? Arendt argues that all thinking moves from experience in the world. And she is always holding up the particular over the universal, and the important that we create meaning, and that we make experiences, particular experiences of individuals, last, that we create a sense of durability, that people might be remembered, that stories might be remembered. And for her, this is a different kind of work than the production of knowledge, than the production of epistemologies, of trying to create a certain narrative about how things are. We need stories in order to have meaning, in order to make meaning from our experiences. The other part of speech here, for language in part for Arendt, is that when she covers the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of Hitler's logicians in Jerusalem, she argues that the banality of evil thesis, which you might have heard from, meant not that he was stupid, but that he lacked a capacity to think, that he lacked the capacity to imagine the world from the perspective of another, and that talking to him was like talking to a brick wall, and that all of his language was this prefabricated language, which was what he thought he was supposed to say. And he had a kind of storehouse of cliches and stock phrases, and whenever he heard something, he would respond with what it set off. So there was no active engagement in the process of thinking, he was just speaking without meaning. I see there are more questions now.
Yeah, there is actually a lot of very good questions as well. So you have LV. LV has been asking a question about the internet, which I guess it's very timely. LV, are you here?
Hey, yeah, I am. Thanks a lot for the lecture. My head is still hurting a bit from all the info, but it was great. So I was asking what Arendt would think of the internet. Could it function as a public or political sphere where new beginnings are possible and where we can stand outside of the historical time, as you mentioned? Or would for Arendt the lack of physicality be too problematic to truly speak of the internet as a public sphere?
That's a great
question. What do you think?
And hold on,
that's a great
Gaspar as well that wanted to kind of ask a question similar to that. So maybe you go ahead, Gaspar, and tell us in relation to the question of Elvi. Where are you, Gaspar? I'm trying to sandwich all the question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, LV question does the job actually, because I would lead to that thinking about speech linguistics or how we organize data nowadays and how the internet goes. But
yeah,
okay, super, thank you.
Yes, so this is a great question. I remember about 15 years ago, or was it 20 now? I'm at that point where time collapses, but when laptops became, everybody had one, right? Home computers, if any of you remember that. There were a number of articles in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s about Arendt and the possibility of the internet as a new polis, as a new public space. So there are some people who have thought through that, and I think it's a difficult question. It's something that I go back and forth on. The internet is not the public sphere. The internet is a social space. Even now, we're appearing before one another on this platform, which has been organized, that we participate in. I can look at you and I can see you, but there is no process of recognition in the way that recognition occurs when we appear before one another physically in a public space where we encounter one another as human beings. There's a kind of sense of splitting that happens, what I would call a kind of split subjectivity. I'm looking at a grid of faces. My face is one of those faces. Every so often I glance over myself. I can't figure out how to disappear it. And I see Nellie and I see what each of you are doing. And there's not a sense of presence, right? The medium facilitates a kind of distance. So, I think I said at the beginning that we make the world. We physically make the world, and the objects that we interact with mediate our experiences and change our experiences. So if all thinking moves from experience and technological mediums now mediate many of our experiences, how is technology impacting our ability to think? I think this is one of the most important questions we have to think about now philosophically. The lack of physicality would be a problem, right? It's something that we do together. Now we can use internet spaces in order to organize physical spaces for politics. We've seen this happen in various kinds of movement, in the anti-Trump movement, in the Tea Party movement, various forms of political organization that then lead to Occupy Wall Street, that then lead to actual physical forms of acting together in a public space. I think in many ways that the internet represents the triumph of the social, to put it in Arendt's language. Technology, she says toward the beginning of The Human Condition, and what I gave you, that, you know, we would become enslaved to our technological devices, right? And in a certain way, sense, this is what has happened. We need to appear before one another. A life lived, to put it, you know, in the other way, a life lived totally in private, in a way that many of us are living right now in this pandemic moment, cut off from appearing and interacting with other people physically, is not a fully human life, she says in other work. We need to engage with one another.
So I'm going to cut you here because you have a question that is a follow-up to that one. So I think that will like lead very nicely to that. Eleonor, are you here?
Yes. Hi.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that in this notion of appearing, there's a strong performative aspect, and also the idea that there's some sort of fulfillment in the act of appearing. So I'm wondering, can we only appear when others are looking or listening?
That's a very complex question, actually, and there are many different ways that I could answer that question. I'm gonna try and give you Arendt's answer to that question, although there are other answers. So in the human condition, when Arendt talks about appearing, she talks about masking. She talks about, and this echoes the quote from Shar, and taking off the mask. When we appear in public, we put on a mask, right? And this, she takes it to the Greek root, as she often does, and she says the mask serves two purposes. One, to disguise, right, the physical being of the person who is appearing, the actor, right, the stage mask. And it has to allow for the voice to come through, right? So both it has to allow for the action and it has to allow for the speaking. She also ties it to the Latin word persona, right? Persona, which literally means to appear with a mask in public. A person is somebody who appears, right? So appear is to exist, extant, existence. At the beginning of Kant's Critique of Judgment, he talks about how, you know, we literally take up space, right? You exist in the world, which is to stand out. And when you appear before others, when you stand out, we appear with this mask, right? And yes, it is performative, but it's also, for Arendt, revealing of who we are, right? Because she's not collapsing our ability to think and speak and make arguments with our immediate sense of self as an individual, right? So the kind of immediacy of self, that kind of pure naked appearance, doesn't reveal who we are in the way that our arguments reveal our thinking process about the world. So it's not just the I am, but it's the speech that the individual engages in. And this is a way of appearing, which is in certain ways performative. There are different ways that people read that. Can we only appear when others are looking or listening? Appearance for Arendt fundamentally requires appearing before others. This is, I think, a reflection in part of the tradition of German philosophy that she emerges out of. And I have always heard echoes of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit here, where he talks about how self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, but always and only in relation to the other. As a self, you do not exist without and this goes the plurality draws it through. I don't know how many of you have studied philosophy, so I don't want to put it in I want to put it in good language, but we exist in the plural, right? No man is an island, right? We do not exist alone. Our awareness of our existence is dependent upon the existence of the other. Rousseau, to give you a counterexample of that, in his second discourse on the origin of inequality, imagines a state of nature before society, and the individual he imagines doesn't have any awareness of time, has no awareness of death, that he will die. There is not that historical linear time of appearance and disappearance, but also that has no sense of self, has no I, has no ego, has no ich, that can posit an I am, which depends upon relation to the other. So when we appear before others in the world, and I wish I was physically appearing before you now, we see each other, we perceive one another. And my perception of your perception of me informs how I am and how I think about myself as an individual, and vice versa. And in that sense, we require the other, right? We exist in ourselves and for ourselves, always apart from the other, but always only in relationship to the other as well. And so there are different performative aspects to that. But for Arendt, we need to appear and to act and speak before others in order to be fully human. But we also need to be able to go home and close the door and to be alone in our solitude. But for her, even when we're alone in our solitude, and this is how she ends the human condition, she says, the quote from Cato, "Never am I less alone than when I am by myself." Solitude, thinking for her, is described as a two-in-one conversation that you have with yourself. It's a kind of dialogue process where you retreat to the private realm, but you engage with your experiences in the world in a process of thinking to tell a story to yourself about those experiences in order to create meaning. So you're never cut off from the condition of human plurality.
And last question, everyone. Antoine, where are you? Antoine and his last questions. I mean, I must say, Antoine, I am always looking forward to seeing where and from where in your garden you're going to ask this question. It's like, he
Most of
always
the time
has
it's
got,
in my
like,
hammock.
amazing views, you know. I mean, we all want to be in your garden, right?
So yes, my private space is turning into a public space. I love that sentence that said that one believes it is free. One believes he is free because he ignores the causes that determines his life. And I wonder that can we really be free and like speak for ourselves, because we always speak in a certain language that have been taught to us. And today, most of our life goes through like user experienced user journey. And so even if we appear, we think we appear, but we're just prefabricated voices made for the consumption industry, for instance. Even me, I use user journey to help my social volunteers or eco warriors. Even those, they go through a user journey. Can we really speak for ourselves when everything is designed?
To give a bit of context, Antoine is running an NGO with, I mean, maybe you can just give a bit of context to, you know, Samantha as well, about what you do.
So basically, I train people so that they can get involved into society, like taking action, creating or joining an NGO. So I do user journey so that those people that were like only watching TV start to get in action for real. But we use user journey, so maybe we're using them and they're not real free.
Yeah. So meaning and syntax are not fixed. Right? Meaning and syntax are not fixed. Language is not a crystallized artifact. It is alive and is something that we can actively engage with. So various forms, to just, you brought up television, so I'll just say technological mediums. Technological mediums, in many respects, mediate many of our experiences on a day-to-day basis. And when we engage with these technological mediums, we're engaging with prefabricated forms that create a kind of mass user experience that allows for some kind of variation between individuals in the way that they engage these platforms. But and this goes back to the question of thinking that I brought up. There are ways to engage with these mediums, right? There are different ways and there are people who are doing work to think about coding, for example, or platform design and how it mediates experience. This is in part why Arendt emphasizes the society of physical in the world and physical engagement with one another in order to facilitate meaningful experience, which is not conditioned by I don't know what the right phrase is, by these kind of mass social platforms. When you think about what happens when you engage with something like Facebook or Twitter, where you are generating information which is being used to treat you as a kind of known entity or quantity or object has certain value, right, for the platform, for marketers, for advertisers, for politicians. We willingly engage in the production of this information every time we turn on our television, log into Facebook or Twitter. And I think it's a very serious question. We have to think about how we engage these platforms in meaningful ways, because I don't suspect we're going to stop engaging with them. But if we can understand how they work, then I think that we can reconfigure meaning. We can, and yeah, I think it's a good question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, everyone, I think we're gonna wrap it here and wish an amazing day to, can you hear me, to Samantha Hill. And am I making sense, or am I still cutting in and out?
You're good. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Nelly. Thank you so much. And I know I threw a lot at you in 45 minutes. So Nelly has my email address, and I'm teaching The Human Condition online in May for the Brooklyn Institute, if anybody wants to read more Hannah Arendt. But good luck. You're in very good hands.
Thank you so much. Okay, everyone, I see you all tomorrow. Remember, Shabazz has been rescheduled. We will let you know. He told me about 1 day or 2 days notice, so I will inform you of that. So there is no Shabazz Palace tonight. But tomorrow we all meet at, well, actually we all meet. You can come for the first part of the workshop with Dali. Dali is a lecturer that responded to our open call, and she will give a class on making 1-minute videos involving dance and the imaginary. You're welcome to stay for the beginning, everybody, of that workshop. And then after, unfortunately, we have to leave. You know, anyway, you know the shebang. So with no more ado, have a lovely day. See you all later, and goodbye. Bye-bye.